Welcome to week 47 of Chronological Bible Teaching's Bible Literacy Movement. By now, you're in the trail of Paul on his missionary journeys. Paul is the premier missionary after Jesus himself, and as he travels, he not only travels to preach the gospel in new areas, but he cares about the areas that he's leaving behind. Last week, we looked at the letter that he wrote to the churches of Galatia. Then we looked at the letters he wrote to Thessalonica. This week, we're going to look at his letters to Corinth and Rome. He writes 2 letters to Corinth, probably separated by about half a year period, and then he writes a letter to the Romans. He's never gone to Rome. He hopes to get there, but he's never been there. And he's going to tell us about both of these letters. His letter to the Corinthians deals with issues that are going on in the church. Apparently, a delegation has been sent asking him, how do we deal with these problems? And sharing some problems that are going on. So he deals with division. There are people that say, I'm after Paul, and I follow Christ, and I follow Peter. And Paul says, no, every one of God's servants is just a servant. God's the one who gives the increase. They deal with immorality in the church in more than one way. There's a man sleeping with his stepmother, and Paul says the gathered church has to kick him out. They have to deal with him in church discipline like Jesus commanded. They have to deal with lawsuits in the church, that people are using the public fora to attack other believers, in this case, the courts, and how tragic this is. Paul deals with questions about marriage, and he addresses marriage in a profound and powerful way. He deals with liberty in the church. How does liberty get expressed? How do we limit liberty so that our freedoms don't trample upon the walk of others as they seek to walk with God? He deals with spiritual gifts in the church and the question of tongues. This is a critical question because it keeps arising. He deals with the resurrection. There are some who begin to deny it. And Paul says, if Jesus isn't risen, our faith is in vain. For Paul, the historicity of the resurrection is everything. We're not talking about a fable. We're talking about a historical fact on which all of Christianity hinges. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, Paul says, we're all men most to be pitied. Then he writes, and as you'll read his second letter, the glorious letter to the Romans, the sublimest expression of theology ever written, even though it wasn't written to be theology. It was written as a letter to a church to encourage them in their walk with God. Paul begins by explaining his calling and his debt, that he has a debt to all men, and he has a passion to preach the gospel to everybody, because the gospel is not only the righteousness of God, but it's the power of God. And in the gospel, men are made right with God. And so he unpacks the gospel. He unpacks human sinfulness. He shows how immoral men are sinners against God, how moral men are sinners against God, and even Jews are sinners against the holy God. And he shows that God has made only one way of righteousness, that the Lamb, Jesus Christ, has taken upon himself the sin of all mankind, the final innocent on behalf of the guilty, and his sacrifice is sufficient. In fact, a perfect verse in Romans that is often overlooked is Romans 5:19, because in it he says that by the obedience of the one, the many will be made righteous. The joy of our salvation is that I'm not made righteous by my obedience, but by his. As Paul wrestles with that, then he takes us through how does living in this world, if we're really made right by grace, how does that impact the way we live? And he talks us through and walks us through the wonderful gift of God's Holy Spirit, the Spirit who seals believers, who allows us to know that we're sons, who leads us in prayer, who empowers us in our work, who gives us joy in our walk. When Paul talks to us about the glorious Holy Spirit, the word comes alive and we realize how great is our God and how good are his gifts. We're reminded afresh that, as Paul said, he who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him freely give us all things? This week, you're enjoying all things because of what Jesus did on a week in Calvary and at a resurrection day. Because of that, I invite you to read and enjoy the reading. This week's reading should challenge your heart and stir your mind. So happy reading.